organizations such as the CBC, the advertising agency Color, until he founded his own company called Dreamer, which organizes events for thousands of people such as rock climbing, skydiving, just to name a few. Whereas Ross is an avid public speaker as well as an avid writer and has been featured in Forbes, Huffington Post, and Yahoo Business. He also volunteers as a board member of the Boys and Girls Club, the board member for the Black Business Initiative, and the East Preston United Baptist Church. Therefore, it be resolved that members of this House join me in congratulating Ross Simmons for his many contributions to Nova Scotia workforce, as well as donating his time to these very valuable community organizations. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Barring no more notices of motion, we'll now move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. Time is now 2:52. We'll conclude at 4:22. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, according to a new report out yesterday, Nova Scotia's economy grew by only 0.8% in 2013. That makes us the second worst performing province in all of Canada. In fact, while the rest of the country moves ahead, our province continues to lag behind. Fact is, we do have one roadmap for turning around our economy, Mr. Speaker, and that is the Ivany report. I'd like to ask the Premier, in light of this new information about our stagnated economy, will he now commit to enacting the 19 goals contained in the Ivany report?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to, first of all, thank the Honourable Member for the question. I had an opportunity to meet with Mr. Ivany, members of the Commission today. They're very pleased at the direction the government is going. They're encouraged by the fact that we continue to reach out to the private sector and continue to build the plan that they laid out towards a 10-year vision. Mr. Speaker, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with those members, even though that the Commission no longer is in existence, but all of them have a tremendous contribution to make, and it's their voices over the next number of years that will continue to ensure that we move forward and grow good jobs here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the recommendations of the Ivany Commission itself was that the province put its 19 goals to turn our economy around into legislation, much like we've done before with environmental goals and the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. Since the Ivany Commission has reported, we now find out that not only has our economy flatlined, but manufacturing output is down by 2%, with 14 of 19 industries in outright decline, a real recession in the manufacturing economy where some of the best paying jobs are, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, what more evidence does he need that it's time to actually enact the 19 goals contained in the Ivany report?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how many jobs are going to be created by creating another piece of legislation in this province, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you what Mr. Ivany and all members of that commission said, Mr. Speaker. It is the spirit and the intent of their piece of their work, Mr. Speaker, that will drive this government going forward. That's what they were looking for, Mr. Speaker, is a government that is focused on the future 10 years out, not one that is focused on 10 days out.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Ivany commissioners themselves felt that it would be worthwhile to enact their 19 goals to turn our economy around, much as we have done before on things as important as our environmental targets, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you there is legislation that actually kills jobs in this province, like the budget of the Liberal Party, which adds $500 billion to our debt, which leaves our taxes high, which taxes our young graduates with the highest increase in their taxes in the history of the province. We certainly have seen examples of legislation that kills jobs in this session, Mr. Speaker. It would be nice to see some legislation that actually aims to create the environment to get jobs going again. And the fact of the matter is, we now have the highest taxes in the country. We have the highest power rates. These are issues that really need to be addressed, Mr. Speaker. We've now had almost 7 months under the Liberal government and coming to the conclusion of the second full session since the new government took office, I'll ask the Premier, why has he squandered 2 full sessions of this House and 7 months in office without a real plan to create jobs?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me begin by suggesting to you that the leader of the Conservative Party has run out of questions during this session. It's a good thing we're coming to an end because he likes to stand here and lecture the members of this House when in fact it was, Mr. Speaker, when it was Ray Ivany himself who said it is not the fact that these need to be in legislation, it's the intent of what this report says, and we want to ensure that the government focuses on the intent and commit to long-term jobs, Mr. Speaker. It was this government in 6 months, Mr. Speaker, which ended up taking off, will end up taking off the NDP electricity tax off every power bill in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is this government that has brought in the apprenticeship opportunities for young apprentices in this province, Mr. Speaker, keeping more young people at home. It is, Mr. Speaker, is this government that's investing in research, giving young graduates an opportunity to find that research opportunity here in Nova Scotia. One of the things that the Ivany Commission said very clearly, short-sighted goals will not do it. A government with a long-term vision will make it happen, and that's exactly what Nova Scotia elected on October.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I tabled in this House a briefing note that indicated the Liberal government has estimated and approved the costs of DHA amalgamation, something the Minister of Health subsequently denies. But as the Minister said to reporters yesterday afternoon, and I quote, "No, I have no figure on what it would cost, no." But, Mr. Speaker, this is not what the Health Minister was telling media on the 8th of March this year when the Chronicle Herald reported that the Liberal plan to restructure DHAs would save $13 million a year. And I'll table that report, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier to this: if his Liberal government has yet to determine how much DHA amalgamation will cost Nova Scotia, how are they able to say how much it will save?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me congratulate the Minister of Health on the tremendous work that he's been doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians. I must tell you, Mr. Speaker, there is not a day that goes by where I am not contacted by a healthcare provider or someone involved in the healthcare system who actually congratulates me for appointing the Minister of Health for the ability to act there. Actually, somebody is finally listening, Mr. Speaker. What the Minister of Health has clearly said is that we're going to move from an administrative-focused healthcare system to one that is patient-focused. And let's not lose sight of the fact, Mr. Speaker, this is about patients. Access to healthcare in this province. By breaking down the walls that have been created in this province, we're going to allow Nova Scotians to have greater access to healthcare in every community across this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, following question period, the Minister of Health was unable to provide a figure for what DHA amalgamations would cost. He wasn't able to say what staff or services would be impacted. He wasn't certain how long the process would take. He couldn't even say if the DHA CEOs and vice presidents would be terminated. He suggested some of them might just get new job titles and be moved around. So the most the minister could promise was, and I quote, that it would be an evolving and organic kind of process. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this. Since the Health Minister had no idea what the real or even assumed costs of DHA amalgamation would be, why is the Premier taking Nova Scotia on what could be a costly and chaotic ride where the healthcare system requires immediate attention at the front line and not another Liberal reorganization?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only people in Nova Scotia who has not come to the conclusion that there's too much administration in healthcare and not enough focus on the front line is the Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health is working and collaborating with healthcare providers, healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker, across this province to ensure that we deliver a cost-effective healthcare model, one that is sustainable and one that is focused on the patient, and one that will deliver healthcare to every community across this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I need no lecture from the Premier on reducing administration in the healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, healthcare administration decreased by 2% in the previous 4 years. And Mr. Speaker, with respect to frontline healthcare, we have seen pharmacists being able to deliver flu shots and vaccines, Mr. Speaker. We have seen significant improvements in mental health frontline care.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The briefing note I tabled yesterday also reveals another blatant Liberal broken promise. In the Liberal platform on page 25, in black and white, to reduce healthcare administration costs by $13 million in 2015-16. But, Mr. Speaker, we now know that the Liberal DHA amalgamation is going to result in added administrative costs, not just in the transition year, but several years after that. So once again, the Liberal government is not delivering as advertised. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is, why did he make a promise to Nova Scotians without knowing or having a plan on how to achieve it?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, now we know why Nova Scotians made the decision they did on October 8th. Only in the NDP mathematics could cutting administration actually cost more, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we know for certain, Mr. Speaker, is almost every wait time in this province is above the national average. One of the reasons for breaking down the walls on the healthcare service in this province is to ensure better access, more focus on frontline healthcare, and more focus on wait times. The Minister of Health will end up delivering, Mr. Speaker, not only on the commitment that we've made, but ensuring that Nova Scotians get the kind of healthcare services they deserve, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see the lectures are flying fast and furious across the aisle here this afternoon in the House of Assembly. Mr. Speaker, a moment ago, the Premier expressed his concern about short-term goals, or short-sighted goals, I believe he said. Well, I'll tell you what's a short-sighted goal, Mr. Speaker. Promising to charge Nova Scotia Power the efficiency fee before the election, but then charging it right back to their customers after. That's pretty short-sighted, Mr. Speaker. Promising to balance the budget before the election and driving up our debt another $500 million in your first year, that's pretty short-sighted, Mr. Speaker. Promising to support young grads and then putting the largest tax increase in the history of the province on their backs, that is very short-sighted. Mr. Speaker, no wonder that business confidence in this province reached an all-time low in the month of April, as reported by the CFIB, and I will table that. I would just like to ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, if he's so concerned about short-sightedness, why doesn't he get on with the job of implementing the long-term goals contained in the Ivany report, as they themselves asked?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to get on with the task of, Mr. Speaker, working with the private sector to ensure that we have long-term job growth in this province. We're going to get on with the task of ensuring that we deliver on the commitments we made to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. All we need to do is for the Conservative leader to stop being so pessimistic, Mr. Speaker. All other Nova Scotians are optimistic about the future.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just tabled the report that says the people that create jobs, the small business of the province.
Order, please. The official leader of the opposition, as opposed to the unofficial leader. The leader of the official opposition has the floor. Sorry.
I should watch behind my back. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Speaker?
I'm good. Keep going.
He does have the haircut for it, Mr. Speaker. I will say that. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business says the biggest constraint to actually hiring people in this province is the cost of fuel and energy. 68% of our small businesses said that in the report I just tabled. They aren't very optimistic, Mr. Speaker, when all they see is a shell game of an energy plan from this government that promised them so much more before the elections. They say that taxes and regulations are the second biggest impediment to getting going and creating jobs at 58%, Mr. Speaker, but that they watch a government that raises our taxes and drives up our debt and projects deficits well into the future. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to ask the Premier, how much lower does business confidence have to go before he gets serious about the goals contained in the Ivany report?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to first of all congratulate the Minister of Energy for the tremendous work that he's been doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in the history of this province, shareholders of Nova Scotia Power are being forced to ensure that low-income Nova Scotians have access, Mr. Speaker, to grants. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Energy also is removing the NDP electricity tax in every power bill, Mr. Speaker, as of January 1, which means power rates are going down. But he didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. Continue to ensure that we work on energy efficiency and we drive in competition so that when the fuel prices will continue to decline. Mr. Speaker, that means power rates will continue to go down even further. The Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, has continued to work with businesses across the sector to ensure that we continue to see which tax we can lower to best drive the economy of the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education is working with the university sector to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we take advantage of the great economic engines our universities are, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that young people are here, the great announcements we've made around the Sandbox program, working with private sector and public institutions. The investments we made in research and ensuring that university graduates get their first opportunity here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, in 6 months, Mr. Speaker. That's where we've gone, and we're not stopping there.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see we're not done with the lectures here this afternoon, but the fact of the matter is that actions speak louder than words, and the actions of this government have sent a very strong message to the small businesses that make up the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the ones that have the lowest confidence in the whole country, Mr. Speaker. His actions to add another $500 million to our debt this year, to jack up government spending for years to come with so little to show for it, to project another $1 billion in debt over the life of his government. No wonder they have the second lowest confidence level in all the country, because when it comes to things that they say hold us back, like taxes and regulations, all the Premier offers is more study and no action and more lectures. So, Mr. Speaker, I will ask, as this second full session of the government winds down, how many more Nova Scotians need to leave, or how many more need to lose their jobs before this Premier stops studying and starts taking action?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just laid out very clearly the direction that many cabinet ministers, and I could go through the entire cabinet if you'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, on the positive things that have happened in the last 6 months. But at least he's finally talking, Mr. Speaker, about something that matters to Nova Scotians, instead of criticizing the SPCA and the tremendous work they're doing, ensuring, Mr. Speaker, that we can adopt more dogs in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside-Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Over the last 5 years, according to numbers from Statistic Canada, the number of youth and their employment have been in decline in this province. And I'll table that document, Mr. Speaker. The number of people aged 15 to 65 has declined by 16,500. The number of people aged 65 plus has increased by a whopping 37,600. To make a bad situation worse, the unemployment rate for our youngest workers is sky high. Females 15 to 24 have an unemployment rate of 17.7%, and males of the same age have an unemployment rate of 22.1%. So my question to the ministers, will the minister commit to taking these issues seriously going forward and taking real action to address the looming challenges?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do believe we have been very clear about our concern about our young people, Mr. Speaker, and that is why we have, for example, brought in our graduate scholarships program. For example, the Department of Labour and Advanced Education is very serious about the employment of our young people. For example, that is why we have brought in a new special operating agency for apprenticeships here in this province, Mr. Speaker. Our province, when we took office, our apprentices were taking a full 2 years longer to complete their apprenticeship programs than anywhere else in the country, Mr. Speaker. We're changing that.
The honourable member for Northside-Westmount on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the reason it's taken a full 2 years longer for our apprentices is there's no jobs for them to gain their hours with. The Ivany report points to bold change, drastic change that is needed to turn a major problem around. The House of Assembly has now been sitting for over a month, yet there is no movement towards enshrining the Ivany goals in law. Setting these goals in law would unite the province behind them and send a strong message that these goals are being taken seriously. So my question is, why is the minister hesitant of setting goals and targets in law?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I remain astonished by the Conservative caucus, who appear to believe that if you enshrine something in legislation, it will magically happen. That's not how it works, Mr. Speaker. We have been very clear that we are creating the conditions that will make it possible for business to step up and hire the jobs and create the jobs in Nova Scotia, especially for our young people.
The honourable member for Northside-Westmount on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the youth of our province need to know that Nova Scotia is a place for them in the future. They've been dealt the biggest tax increase they will likely ever see by this government with the elimination of the graduate retention rebate. In the last 5 years, the level of unemployment for males aged 25 to 54 has declined by 10,400. Full-time employment has declined by 23.9% for females and 10.9% for males 15 to 24. These statistics point to drastic changes needed but ignored by the government in this House sitting. So my question to the minister is, how bad do the demographic issues have to get before the minister will take them seriously and take action?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I do believe the biggest impediment to restoring confidence among our business sector and among our young people is, in fact, the negative Nellies across the way over there.
Order, please. Just want to point out to the Honourable Minister that negative Nellies is unparliamentary. And I would ask her to apologize and retract that remark. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
I would like to point out to my honourable colleagues the summer student program, the co-op program that we have added positions to, the Graduate to Opportunities program, which my honourable colleague, the Minister of ERDT, will be announcing shortly. All of these things, coupled with the sandbox announcement, are things that we are doing for our young people, Mr. Speaker, and there'll be more to come. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, on Monday evening, graduates in our Red Room said the graduate retention rebate helped them pay off debt, invest in the economy, and pay their bills. When explaining why the cut of the graduate retention rebate was not followed with an equal investment in programs for young people, the Premier explained that his government needed more time to develop all of these new untested initiatives. Mr. Speaker, if the Premier needed more time for new programs, why did he immediately cut the graduate retention rebate when he could easily have phased it out over a couple of years to ease the burden of the cut on the people it was helping?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the issue around the graduate retention rebate program, Mr. Speaker, is that it was not doing what it was intended to do, which was retain more students. Mr. Speaker, there is absolutely no question. There were some students in this province who, they actually weren't students, Mr. Speaker. Some young Nova Scotians had regained employment and were receiving a tax benefit for having that job in this province. The reason for the graduate retention rebate program was actually to provide opportunities for more students to access the workforce. What we've done is we've taken the money that was involved, the graduate retention rebate program, targeted towards job opportunities and job creation. We understand from students the cost of post-secondary education is creating great pressures on that. We're going to continue the conversation with students, see how we can ensure that post-secondary education is affordable for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, student leaders said they were meeting with the government the very day before the graduate retention program was cut, and they were hopeful that there would be programs based on what they were speaking to the government about. Today in today's Chronicle Herald, students said the loss of the graduate retention rebate redirects about $35 million away from young people. And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why did the government not tell students and graduates that they intended to cut the graduate retention rebate and not reinvest in the programs that they were hopeful that they were going to see based on their advocacy with government members?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member and all members of this House there wasn't a single student who received any of that $50 million that she is talking about. What it was, Mr. Speaker, was a tax benefit to people who had received a job and earned a job in this province. The initiative was to actually try to drive more job opportunities. We recognize that there's a difference between what the graduate retention rebate program was and the investments that we have made. We've invested in reducing, Mr. Speaker, the interest on student loans. We've created a program that is graduate to opportunities in the first year, Mr. Speaker. It is in the infancy of that program. It is our hope, because of the success of that and the combination with working with business owners to provide more opportunities, that program will grow. Mr. Speaker, just like the graduate retention program grew over time, this program, we're doing what a responsible government should do, and that's budget and make sure that we're getting the most effective use of taxpayers' dollars.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, on the backbenches of the Liberal government, there's a former president of the Acadia Students' Union. There's also the MLA for Yarmouth is a former student leader. I wonder if the Premier would tell us what he said to convince these members that it was okay to vote in favor of cutting programs for students without redirecting these funds.
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you. I'll begin again. Can the Premier tell us what he said to convince former student leaders of his government that it was okay to cut a program like the graduate retention rebate without redirecting these funds to help students?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it was today's student leaders who told us the program didn't work. It was today's student leaders, Mr. Speaker, who said the program wasn't doing what it said to get rid of that program, Mr. Speaker. But let me be clear. Let me be clear. We're not questioning whether or not at all that those Nova Scotians that were benefiting from this program actually saw a benefit from it. But the issue of the program was trying to create new job opportunities for university graduates. That's what we've redirected some of that funding into, is to ensure that we provide more job opportunities. Yeah. Student leaders are telling us, just like the members she mentioned have told us, we need to work on post-secondary education affordability. We had hoped, quite frankly, in the last 4 years there might have been some movement on that. What we're going to do is continue to work with university student union presidents. We're going to work with Nova Scotians to ensure the affordability of post-secondary education, Mr. Speaker, for every single Nova Scotian. I want to remind the honourable member, post-secondary education is unaffordable for some Nova Scotians, and we're going to make sure that every Nova Scotian have access to post-secondary education.
The honourable member for PICTOU West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. There's no doubt that the process used to decide school closures was broken and flawed. Mr. Fowler's report made that perfectly clear. He said that school reviews were having a negative impact on the relationship between school boards, parents, and communities. Schools and the Schenectady Central Regional School Board are being forced to live by decisions made under a broken system, and I know that from the other side of the floor here we've been talking about being negative and pessimistic, but I am positive and optimistic that the Minister of Education will hopefully demand that the Schenectady Regional School Board will suspend decisions made under the broken process.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my thanks to the member opposite for the question. And, you know, the member has made a statement that is very true in that the school review process can have a negative impact, and the intent of the new legislation is try to reduce the negativity and perhaps build some collaboration and some trust. And I could go on to tell the member that I've stated this publicly, that I have asked that the Chignecto board look at the decisions that they made that were conditional, and that they would give those schools impacted an additional year. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that. That's very positive and hopeful, especially for the River John Consolidated School, because it is the lifeline of the community. Residents are working very hard to develop a hub school model to ensure the building is completely utilized and the community is well served. Hoping that the Minister will throw the community of River John a lifeline and act to make sure the school is not closed before every option is examined, and I'm hoping that she can confirm that.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. The request, the informal request that went to Chignecto board was to have the time frame extended by 1 year on those conditional closure motions. The formal request has gone to the board chair, and the board chair has informed me that that will be on the agenda when the board meets. I believe it's May the 6th. So I would encourage the member opposite to work with her school board member to ensure that her concerns are heard and that her school board member takes them to that public board meeting.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer. I'm a little bit perplexed because there's a lot of parties involved in this situation that's happening. I'm just wondering if she could table that formal request that was made to the Chignecto Regional School Board, and if it was perhaps informal, if she's willing to maybe provide a letter now, just so that the parents and teachers and children even that have been attending all these meetings that I have been going to, that they actually have a paper trail, because I know they want to believe that the Minister did request that to the school board, and it would just give them much comfort. So,
the Honourable Minister of Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if the member is questioning the statement that I've made or not. I did make a formal request, and I'd be glad to give her a copy.
The Honourable Member for Truro-Bible Hill-Millbrook-Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today through you is to the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, an important and respected organization, the Women's Institutes of Nova Scotia, has been enriching our province for more than 100 years. This vibrant organization currently has over 700 members who contribute in excess of 100,000 volunteer hours every year. The organization recently had to inform its members that its annual operating grant of just $27,000 for the current fiscal year is being discontinued by the Minister's department. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is why has the Minister chosen to no longer fund this organization's operating grant?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, and it's a very important question. I did meet with the Women's Institute last year. Actually, your government had decided not to fund the Women's Institute for the $27,000. I did have the $27,000 put in place last year at the end of the year after I met with them and proceeded with that. And I've made arrangements for a little bit different structure this year. But if you'd like to ask me another question, I could describe that in more detail.
The Honourable Member for Truro-Bible Hill-Millbrook-Salmon River on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The volunteer hours that these women contribute to our communities represent more than $1 million in unpaid work that are donated to the province. And their service at our homeless shelters, food banks, women's centres, and countless other community organizations is really invaluable. So my question through you, Mr. Speaker, is, are you saying that you are going to fund $27,000 of operating grants? You're going to continue that to the Women's Institutes of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Yes, we will, but it's going to be a little different structure this year. What I proposed to the Women's Institute last year when I met with them was we were very interested in continuing supporting them. They do very important work in the community. A wonderful group of ladies that are very dedicated to agriculture in the province. But what I've suggested they may do is help us promote some of our industries, wine industry, the agriculture industry, do some displays and offer them some promotional material to do that and work with the industry to do that, because I think that would give them an opportunity to get their profile higher in the community and also service a very important function for us in promoting locally grown and produced products.
The honourable member for Truro-BIBLE, Hill-Millbrook, Salmon River on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I take it what you're proposing is a work fair type of deal. Is that what you're suggesting? Sorry, through you, Mr. Speaker. Is the minister suggesting a work fair type of situation for this incredibly important organization that puts so many volunteer hours into so many of our different organizations right across the province for over 100 years? So I've heard through the grapevine and through speaking with them that this is what indeed you're suggesting, is that in order to get any money now, they need to actually do some work for you, for your department, for that funding?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
No, that is not correct. We're going to fund the Women's Institute for $27,000. We also want to work with them to help promote Nova Scotia products in the superstores or grocery stores, wherever, the ones that they want to do. It'd be totally voluntary on their part. We will provide the materials to do that, and it's going to be a working relationship between our department and the Women's Institute, which I think is very important. Very well-respected organization, and what a better group there was for them to do that and work closely with us in that regard. And again, it's totally voluntary, and we look forward to working with them, and they were very receptive to that approach when I met with them earlier this year.
The honourable member for Colchester-MUSQUODOBOIT Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is for the Premier. In 2009, the Premier said he would introduce fixed dates for elections, for legislature, for the budget. And in December also indicated that he would move to set fixed election dates. I remember how I felt last summer and fall, waiting and waiting for a date to be called. So I'm just going to ask the Premier through you when he might table legislation to introduce fixed election dates.
The Honourable Premier.
Before the next election.
The honourable member for Colchester-MUSQUODOBOIT Valley on his first supplementary.
Oh, that was a quick question. Quick answer. Yesterday, the Chief Electoral Officer for the province told us that we could probably save $500,000 if we set a fixed date. So, my question to the Premier, through you, the Speaker, is would the Premier consider meeting with the other two parties to help set some dates in the future?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've demonstrated I'm always open for good suggestions, so I'll be more than happy to listen to anyone who wants to give me a good idea, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is to the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, more than 80,000 public sector workers are asking questions about the Minister of Finance's most recent budget address, where she suggested wage increases were unsustainable, and she said, and I quote, "We need a new approach, and we must be innovative and creative in tackling these issues." Mr. Speaker, the last time the Liberals were in government, they rolled back wages and they laid off hundreds of nurses, teachers, and other government workers. So my question to the Minister is this. Will the Minister respect public sector workers and explain to those hardworking Nova Scotians in our public sector what she means by her new approach.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. And essentially, there's an easy answer to this question, and it is that all of us need to work together to find a way for Nova Scotia to be on a firm fiscal footing. And Mr. Speaker, we've already demonstrated we respect the collective bargaining process, and we hope to work very well with all of the unions that we're involved with. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I know that we all have the greatest respect for people in the public sector and in our workforce, but this is a very serious matter for public sector workers who can read the words of the minister and who do get concerned when they see language like, you know, we have to rise above narrow interests, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the same budget address, the Minister of Finance said that a wage increase of 2% is, quote, simply not sustainable, which is a far cry from what her leader said when they were in opposition, where he said, and I quote, the efforts of many Nova Scotians have not been rewarded because wages were essentially flat. So, Mr. Speaker, since 2% is not sustainable, can the minister tell the 80,000 public sector workers affected what she considers to be a sustainable wage increase?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from the honourable member. And Mr. Speaker, as all of us know in the House, we have to respect the collective bargaining process, and that will ultimately determine where each of the agreements go in future. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't know that we all know that we need to respect the collective bargaining process, given that we've had Bill 37 imposed on the workers of this province. But, Mr. Speaker, in a Canadian Press article from March the 14th, it says, and I quote, civil service job cuts are not a priority in this year's budget. So it's not in this year's budget, but we don't know where the government will proceed in subsequent years. Public sector workers know what the Liberal Party did in the 1990s, and they are worried that this history could repeat itself. So my final question to the minister is, will those workers in our public sector expect to see wage freezes, wage rollbacks, or layoffs under the Liberal government?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's really important to remind members of the House that when we came to office just 6 months ago, the Premier made a concerted effort to visit every single department in the downtown core and in the far-flung corners of this province to speak to civil servants and to engage them in the work we have ahead of us. We know that all of the challenges that we face are going to require the creativity and innovation and frankly, the experience of our civil servants and the public service, and we hope to work with them at every step of the way, and I know all other members are following the Premier's example.
The Honourable Member for Lunenburg.
Mr. Speaker, in 2011, the South Shore Regional School Board received a 50% funding cut from the provincial government. This resulted in significantly reduced services where some school libraries are operating 1 out of 6 days of the week and leaving some high schools like Forest Heights without a functioning library. School libraries play a significant role in the developing of literacy and research skills that will benefit students when they move on to their professions or pursue a post-secondary education. My question: will the Department of Education work with school boards to develop and invest in our school libraries?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. It's true that during the previous 3 years, school boards did have severe cuts to the funding and had to make some very difficult decisions as to how they provided services and supports. However, Mr. Speaker, we have changed the way that we're providing funding to boards, and we will target funding so that boards will have to provide the services that we deem to be important, and library services may well be one of those in the future.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask a question to the Minister of Energy. I know we haven't asked too many questions of him this sitting, so I thought, as we're getting close to an end, we would ask him a question and listen to what kind of interesting things he'll have to say. Larry Hughes of Dalhousie University is skeptical that the changes to efficiency Nova Scotia will result in savings to consumers. In today's All Nova Scotia, he suggests that changing the way electricity is billed by offering off-peak incentives would be best, and I'll table that, of course. So my question, can we expect the government to review electricity billing in order to bring down electricity costs for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, just to clarify, what Mr. Hughes actually said was he said that he was skeptical over the energy savings energy savings amounts that Efficiency Nova Scotia said they had achieved last year. He actually didn't say anything one way or the other about the particular changes that we made in that article. And in fact, I've spoken to him about it myself. But to the member's question, it's actually a very good question, and what he's talking about is time of day pricing. The member may be aware that time of day pricing is actually specifically included in the RFPs and the reviews that just went out and are part of the electricity review underway at the moment. I will say, however, in some places where we've switched to time of day rates, the amount paid by consumers has actually increased, not decreased, because of course the times that most people use energy are during the peak price times, which are higher than they would be now. So it is under review, but we shouldn't assume that it's necessarily a cheaper option.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much. And I mean, the quote is, it's not really a quote because it's just written, of course, in this article. Larry Hughes, professor in electrical engineering at Dalhousie University, is skeptical of the benefits touted by Efficiency Nova Scotia. He says that if the goal is to save all Nova Scotia electricity customers money, the province needs to change the way electricity is billed. So we recognize that the government is currently conducting electricity review. But as this review is conducted, Nova Scotians will continue to pay the highest electricity rates in the country. This new electricity plan is not expected to be introduced somewhere near 2015 at early 2016. So my question to the minister, does the government plan to enact any relief for ratepayers in the meantime over the next couple of years?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, last night the legislature voted in favour of removing a tax from electricity bills, which would be the first time in recent memory that bills will have actually gone down. It's unfortunate that the other member voted against that, and in fact voted in favour of bills going up for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington on his final supplementary.
Well, what we voted against was smoke and mirrors. That's what we voted against. We voted against a shell game when you promise one thing and produce another. So, trying to stick to the question at hand, though, smart grid technologies enable ratepayers to better understand their energy consumption and save money. It can also better promote time of day billing and put less of a strain on the electricity system. So my question, can the minister provide details on his discussions regarding smart grid technologies with Nova Scotia Power and the potential benefits of an upgraded grid could have for ratepayers?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, that answer would probably take the rest of the question period. But what I will say is I find it interesting that the member is suggesting moving to a smart grid technology when in fact that the people that would have to pay for that are ratepayers, and in every jurisdiction that has moved to, ratepayers have actually had a charge on their bills which has increased their rates to pay for the new meters and the new grid infrastructure and so forth. The reality is, as I said earlier, it is under review, it is being studied to see whether there's benefits, but let's not assume that it automatically will result in net savings to ratepayers, because the experience in most jurisdictions, because, quite frankly, because of the time of day that most people work and most people use electricity, there aren't that many people getting up at 2 a.m. To do their laundry, to take advantage of the cheaper overnight rates, means that in most cases, bills actually go up.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Premier. All members of the House heard from many nurses, Mr. Speaker, as they came to the legislature through law amendments to speak up against Bill 37. It took a lot of courage for many of them. They came here, they tried to explain to government members what the conditions were that they were working in, and really advocating for their patients, Mr. Speaker. But many of them now are facing discipline. Disciplinary hearings are scheduled to begin next week, Mr. Speaker, for over 170 of these nurses. So I would like to ask through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, why does the Premier think it's appropriate for these nurses to be disciplined when they were only standing up for their rights, but more importantly, the rights of their patients?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the honourable member would know that this is something between the nurses and their employer, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
I could take that as an answer, Mr. Speaker, but the Premier has made comments about this. The Premier and his government have hit nurses time and time again since taking office. First, they took away their rights to fair collective bargaining process through Bill 37. Then they cut the graduate retention tax rebate for young nursing grads, Mr. Speaker, which many of them have contacted us that said they benefited from that program. And now, I know his comments from earlier really supported, I think, Capitol Health's position around punishing nurses and having disciplinary action put against them, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask through you, Mr. Speaker, the Premier, what is the Premier's plan to reestablish good relations with the nurses of Capitol Health and really around the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind the honourable member that it was this government that protected, Mr. Speaker, the right to strike for healthcare workers. It was the former, Mr. Speaker, it was the former New Democratic Party that stripped that right away from paramedics across this province, Mr. Speaker. We remember that. It wasn't all that long ago. We also remember, Mr. Speaker, that every union leader supported the NDP's decision to strip the right to strike away from paramedics. We believe we did right, which was bringing essential service legislation, which would protect essential services at the same time allowing healthcare providers to exercise their right to strike.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the over 170 nurses that took job action to try to protest against Bill 37 were doing the right thing, Mr. Speaker. They were trying to advocate not only for themselves, Mr. Speaker, but more importantly for the patients that they serve. One presenter after another, Mr. Speaker, told about conditions that they work under and that things needed to change. Morale is low at Capitol Health, Mr. Speaker, and with Bill 37, I think we'll see that morale go even lower across the province, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why won't the Premier accept that the treatment of nurses has been unfair and begin to give nurses the respect they so richly deserve and support them in calling off Capitol Health on the disciplinary action that's going to take place next week, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Minister of Health has made it very clear that nurses make a tremendous contribution, Mr. Speaker, in the healthcare system. Without them, quite frankly, it couldn't function. We know that, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health has also listened to nurses when they're here. He's already engaged in Capitol Health to look at the staffing issues that were brought up, Mr. Speaker, not only Capitol Health, but indeed across the province. There are some challenges. Those are not things that belong in the collective agreement, Mr. Speaker. They are going to be solved by the Minister of Health, who has finally paid attention to the issues that nurses have been talking about now for a couple of years, quite frankly. And I know the honourable member is not suggesting that illegal job action should be tolerated by anyone in this province, is he?
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker. My question to you, Mr. Speaker, through you, is to the Minister of Education. Prior to and during the election, the Liberals promised to invest in education to the tune of $65 million. The Liberals promised this investment would happen immediately, and I have a Chronicle Herald article which clearly states, and I will table that, and it clearly states in that article that as of February 19th of this year, the minister is claiming that was, and I quote, never the case. So my question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the minister is why did she tell Nova Scotians the investment would be made immediately if that was never her intention?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have that question raised in the House today because I'm very proud of the budget that we've been able to build that will, over the course of our mandate, reinvest $65 million back into the public system.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess there's different definitions of immediately. About a year ago, on January 30th, 2013, the Chronicle Herald published another article about the Liberal commitment to education. It says, and I quote, the entire amount would be restored in the first full year of a mandate, which is typically 4 years. So difference between definitions, I guess, of immediate. So my question is, how long will Nova Scotians have to wait before the investment of $65 million is made?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will repeat that the commitment that I have made as Minister and the budget building process that I began this year is reinvesting $65 million into the public schools in this province over the course of our mandate.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, in this House and during budget estimates, I asked the Minister to provide budget details outlining where $65 million was actually removed from the budget in previous years. The Minister hasn't produced that evidence yet because I know, Mr. Speaker, we all know that evidence does not exist. So my question is, why should Nova Scotians have any faith the Minister will keep her promise to invest this $65 million at all when she has a track record of not being forthright with them?
Order, please. I'd like to remind the Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's that implying that the Honourable Member opposite has a poor track record is unparliamentary. Would you please retract that statement? Forthright. Pardon me. The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Pardon? I said I will retract that.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I do want to respond to comments that have just been made by the member opposite. During estimates, after a lengthy debate, the member opposite asked that the evidence to support the $65 million cut to public schools be tabled. As Minister, I tabled that. I'm surprised that this member has not looked at that.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister, through you to the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Agriculture has taken the initiative to promote local grass-fed beef in our province, and Nova Scotia is an ideal place to encourage this, as forage land represents 65% of the total cropland province-wide. Mr. Speaker, my question is, can the Minister confirm that the grass-fed beef industry is still a priority for this new government?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
We are presently reviewing that policy, and as it appears at the present time, we're going to be possibly funding some more activities in that area.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, many rural areas in our province are facing issues with the lack of provincially inspected meat processing facilities. Farmers are being forced to travel as far as PEI because many facilities do not have space. Mr. Speaker, while in opposition, the now Minister of Health told reporters smaller processing plants serving local markets may be the answer for the beef industry. He further pointed out that the province is promising local grass-fed beef, but many areas don't have the kill floor capacity. Local beef plants are a necessary component of developing that part of the industry. And I will table those comments from the now Minister of Health. Does the Minister agree with his Cabinet colleague?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
I thank the Honourable Member for that question. It's a very important part of the agriculture industry is processing. The unfortunate thing of it is that it has to be Canadian Food Inspection Agency inspected. We have provincially inspected facilities that work very well, but unfortunately if we're going to ship outside of Nova Scotia we need Canadian Food Inspection certified facilities. It's very expensive. We have to have a certain mass of product to put through the facility so it runs on a continuous basis, and unfortunately we don't have that volume at the present time in Nova Scotia. I look forward to the day we do have that volume and we do have the provincially and federally inspected facility here so we can sell our product outside of Nova Scotia. That's in the beef industry. We do have a facility that's very nearly ready to move forward in the sheep industry, so we're working very hard on that one.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister's response, and I would like to say that, yes, I recognize that volume is an issue in this question, and so are federal and provincial inspections. Mr. Speaker, in that same article, the now Minister of Health went on to say that the Liberal plan favours a beef industry initiative comparable to the Orchard Renewal Program because the industry is going to need some investment. My question to the Minister is, what plan can the Minister deliver to the beef industry in Nova Scotia? When can we expect the details?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Again, I'd like to thank you for the member for that very important question. It's a very important part of our industry. We are presently working with the beef industry to see what we can do to, as we are in all sectors of agriculture, to see if we can increase the productivity, also the profitability of the organizations, because they're not profitable, this won't work. So we're working towards that, and there are some initiatives that we will be taking in the future, which I can't discuss today because we're not ready to announce them.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, a drug which helps keep juvenile arthritis in remission is no longer available. Aristaspan is an injection that helps juvenile arthritis patients with their pain and their inflammation. Valeo Pharma, the company which distributes this drug in Nova Scotia and elsewhere, says the decision to take the drug off the market came from a third-party manufacturer. My question for the Minister, can the Minister inform the House today whether he or officials in his department have been in contact with the third-party manufacturer to find out why they have taken the drug off the market?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm aware of this important drug that has served some patients in Nova Scotia very, very well. I have not determined as to why it has been taken off the market. I do know that there are a number of other medications that have now been developed and have come forward, and hopefully those will in fact accomplish the same benefits to our patients suffering from arthritis.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister. Dr. Suzanne Ramsey, pediatric rheumatologist at the IWK, refers to Aristaspan as the gold standard medication, saying there is not a substitute medication better than this one. 1,000 children, unfortunately, in this province suffer from juvenile arthritis. Can the Minister tell children suffering from juvenile arthritis in Nova Scotia what the department's plan might be for their treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the first plan is to look at how we can go about obtaining through Health Canada another manufacturer from which this Ristopan can be procured. So that process is being investigated, and we hope that we can get a satisfactory result.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dr. Peter Dent, a professor emeritus of pediatrics at McMaster University and the head of the Division of Pediatric Rheumatology and Immunology at McMaster Children's Hospital, said he believes a profit motive may have been at the root of this problem. The executive director of the Canadian Arthritis Society for the Maritimes, Susan Tilley-Russell, says the drug is a life changer for those children who need it. My final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. When will the Minister be able to confirm whether he has any details about the current supply of this drug and how much longer Nova Scotia children will be without it, and maybe elaborate on the plan that he just spoke of by way of what might come next?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, and as the member opposite now is realizing, and more and more, Canadians, is that some of the medications and the pharmaceuticals that we relied on to be manufactured here in Canada, we're finding now that they are letting go of that, because just as he suggested, profit margins, amounts of sales are in fact for just limited quantities. And so this is really part of that bigger picture of looking at future procurement, not just here in Nova Scotia, but right across the country. And we're hoping that the Pan-Canadian Drug Alliance and through Health Canada, that we can find other companies that will provide this. And this is an area that the Department of Health has already started to look into, as I know the work of Dr. Ramsey at the IWK, and as a rheumatologist, as she is a strong advocate of this medication. We'll do all we can to keep it in the hands of Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, in last week's edition of the Shelburne Coast Guard, residents expressed concern over the condition of the Ferry West Road and Locks Island Road. Mr. Speaker, what is the Minister's of Transportation timetable on when repairs will be completed for the Ferry West Road and Locks Island Road?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure exactly the specific details of the roads that the honourable member is referring to. I could certainly have the staff who are very committed and do a great job down in that region of the province to have a look and provide me some update and some details on the assessment for that road. But I obviously don't have those specifics in front of me at this time. Thanks.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, while tough winter weather will always add to the list of local roads in needs of repair, a multi-year local roads plan will provide more transparency in the transportation budget. Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister review the research the Department prepared for the last government that showed a multi-year roads plan will indeed be possible?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. With respect to the local roads plan, I honestly don't see any merit in establishing a long-term 5-year plan for local roads, because the dynamics of the roads, and there's many of them across the province, over 20,000 kilometres of roads that we service as a provincial government, 9,000 kilometres of those are unpaved, Mr. Speaker. I think that doing the local roads year over year provides us with that flexibility. As an example, for his first question, if there are immediate repairs required for that road and it wasn't in the plan, then we wouldn't have the ability to respond and make those changes. So for us, it provides us with that leniency and that flexibility to react to the most pressing issues in all regions of the province and establish our priorities based on road safety and based on what's needed at that specific time. So I think the fact that we do local roads year over year is a testament to the fact that we need flexibility, and we'll make changes as they come up in the immediate term to make sure that Nova Scotians are safe. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this minister has admitted that the previous government's 5-year road plan has taken the politics out of paving, and he has explained that he does not think he would or should have a multi-year road plan because of weather, saying, and I will table this from Hansard, and I quote, "Things deteriorate quickly, and that becomes a priority," end of quote. And Mr. Speaker, just a quick reminder that this minister, I just want to remind this minister that the very first hours of this government, he sold a paving plan. He's looking at reviewing options of turning paved roads. Yeah, I haven't. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask the members opposite to save the applause because I'm not through my question yet. So I really appreciate the interest. The very first hour, saved the paving plan, reviewing options. This minister reviewing options of turning paved roads back into gravel, has no 5-year plan, and I may suggest that this minister is no more than a speed bump, and a very large speed
Order,
bump.
please. I'd like to ask the honourable member for Queen Shelburne to retract that unparliamentary comment about the minister. The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
I'll retract that statement.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Speaker, my question, can the ministers tell us, in the interest of transparency, because I believe every Nova Scotian can see through this government, what local roads has been identified for this year and are not on his 1-year road plan? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, with the question, again, the roads plan, the local roads plan, is done on an annual basis based on the need for Nova Scotians and the need of the regions within this great province. So the member's right. We don't apply politics to these decisions. I'm not sure if he's referring to a specific road, but I can tell you that I have complete faith, and our government has complete faith in the system that's been established by the experts within TIR who make these decisions, and we take their lead with respect to the local roads that are being done. I also want to address the fact that, Mr. Speaker, we've had many decisions. Some are tough and some vary along that spectrum in terms of difficult decisions that I can tell you. The paving plant was a very easy one for this government, both on a philosophical level and, of course, on a numerical level, Mr. Speaker. We made the right decision for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, and we stick with that. So, look, we're doing our best that we can. Obviously, the member should understand, as a former cabinet minister, that we're doing the right things with the limited budget that we have, and we're making good decisions on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. And I'm certainly no speed bump, Mr. Speaker. I'm learning as I go. I'm making good decisions, and I'm very proud of our government and the steps we've taken to make Nova Scotians safer in this province. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Hey, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that I have to agree that the minister is not a speed bump. He's only a little blimp. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Natural Resources. 10 years ago, announcements were made about the planned opening of the Donkin mine. Recently, Strata has said that they are not going to move forward and they're looking for a buyer. I wonder if the minister could tell us if there's been any success in identifying some potential buyers and where that whole process stands at this time.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to the Donkin mine, I will say that this government knows the importance of that mine for the economy of Cape Breton, and we will do all in our power to support the operations of that mine. Of course, the mine becoming operational is dependent on market forces, Mr. Speaker, primarily the international price point of coal. However, what we're hearing from experts in the industry is that market is starting to turn around, and I believe fully and have hope that that will lead to a situation where a commercial agreement between Glencore and another company will be highly possible.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his first supplementary.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to say to the minister, thank you for that answer, because he's right, it would be important to Cape Breton, but it actually the mine development will be important to all Nova Scotians, because we would get a good quality coal, produced locally, bought in Canadian dollars, and would help stabilize power prices for people right across the province, not just Cape Breton. So, Mr. Speaker, with that in mind, I wonder if the minister could tell us just how recently he and the Minister of Energy have had discussions about where the Donkin Mine project is, and if I know there may be some things that he can't release in the House, but there's many people in our area and around the province that are really wondering where this project is going. They're interested in being able to work at home instead of away. It could create 300 direct jobs, and I was just hope that the minister could tell us if he and the Minister of Energy have had any discussions recently.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been in continuous conversations with the folks from Glencore and internally within the government on the situation there. I will say that there are few proponents of that mine greater than the Minister of Transportation. He has been a vocal advocate of Cape Breton since I've known him and has done a great job ensuring that our government understands the importance of Donkin and that our government is doing the very best we can to ensure that once the market allows for a commercial agreement to take place, that we facilitate that process for happening.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I want to thank the Minister for that answer. And I agree that the Minister of TIR is a strong advocate. And I would hope that in your cabinet discussions that you will sit down and really work on them about fixing the road going into Donkin so that when the time comes for the mine to start, we'll actually have a good road to drive on and we'll be able to get the materials in there. The last part of what I'm going to say to you is that this development is important for the economy of the province of Nova Scotia. We've heard many of you on that side talk about wanting to move the economy forward. We all do in our own different ways. So I would just encourage that you and your cabinet colleagues do whatever you can to move forward this project, because there are many people who are looking for and depending on it. So I hope I can get the commitment of the Minister of Natural Resources that he will do everything in his power to make this project move forward.
I'm not sure if that was a question, but the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the importance of Donkin to the folks of Cape Breton and the impact that it can have on the economy and perhaps energy prices in the province as well. I do offer my commitment and the commitment of this government to do all in our power to support the Donkin project. I will say, however, this is a private, it's a private enterprise, Mr. Speaker. It's going to be primarily dependent on market factors. But when the time comes, I believe that those factors will help us lead to a commercial agreement and the operation being reopened of Donkin Mine.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, the IVNY report indicated that our traditional industries, including agriculture, need to be key economic drivers of our economy in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Agriculture has programs related to land development, which are key to expanding agricultural production and have been some of the most popular programs the Department of Agriculture has had. The land development programs are jointly cost-shared between Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture and Agriculture Canada. Will the Minister inform this House of the details of these cost-sharing agreements with Ottawa, and will he supply a detailed list of the work scheduled to be done in the coming year?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, and the Honourable Member is absolutely right. It's very important that we grow the economy in agriculture and fisheries and aquaculture in the province of Nova Scotia. The rural jobs are very important jobs, and the information is requested. As soon as I can release it, I will release the information to the legislature.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, when new farmland is being developed, there's nothing more important than tile drainage, ditching, and land clearing. These are essential programs. Nova Scotia Republicans understand that there has been a general loss in productive farmland to other forms of land development. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, will the Minister confirm his department's commitment to expanding the actual land base of agriculture in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. That's another very important question for all Nova Scotians and indeed their whole country. And the preservation of agricultural land in this province is critical. We have seen a lot of the land being built into subdivisions, which is not acceptable, and we're working on a strategy now to ensure that that doesn't continue and ensure that we can bring back into production some of the lands that have been taken out of production because of other issues and other opportunities that people have pursued.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for the answer to that question. Mr. Speaker, we live in a province which obliges us as farmers to invest in both irrigation and drainage. The drainage programs and ditching programs have been some of the most popular programs the department has had, and demand for these programs far outstrips the funding available. Is the Minister attempting or working to sign new agreements with Ottawa to increase funding for these programs?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we are. We're in the process now of finishing off some programs that are in place. We intend to pursue more programs that will help the industry. As I said earlier, it's critically important with the looming shortage of food supply in the next 20 to 40 years that we preserve our land, our agricultural land, and even if we get all of our land back in production, which won't be practical because of some of the things that have happened to it in the meantime, we're still not going to be able to meet the demand. And just to add to that, we only produce 20% of the food that we consume in Nova Scotia, so most Nova Scotians don't realize that, and we're going to do everything we can to get that number up and also to increase our exports and help our economy.
The Honourable Member for Truro-Bible Hill-Millbrook-Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question to you, through you today, is also for the Minister of Agriculture, a very popular gentleman today. Mr. Speaker, community-supported agriculture is a way for all of us, even if we live in urban areas, to support small-scale local producers and enjoy farm-fresh food. Better known as CSA, this process engages community members as shareholders in farms, and there are now over 30 farms operating under this model in Nova Scotia. So through you, Mr. Speaker, could the Minister please advise us of how many meetings he has had so far with the CSA community since taking over as Minister of the Department of Agriculture?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important part of our agriculture in our province, and we will continue to work with those organizations to ensure that they grow and prosper as time moves forward.
The Honourable Member for Truro-Bible Hill-Millbrook-Salmon River on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I take it from that answer that perhaps the Minister has not had a chance to meet with those organizations yet. And I hope that he does so in the future. In 2013, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party told Nova Scotians that if elected, they would, quote, make certain that local products are present in our academic and healthcare facilities. And I will table that. But they have yet to tell us how they're going to do that, Mr. Speaker. So my final question through you is to the Minister. Will the Minister please tell this House when he will follow through on this election promise and how much it will cost?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, it's a very important question. We are presently working with many institutions in the province to ensure we have the maximum amount of locally grown products in their facilities, and we're getting a very good response. I know the Department of Health has set a standard in their facilities for doing this, and we're going to follow the model they have, and we're working very closely with some other organizations in that regard, including the Ecology Action Centre.
The Honourable Member for Truro-Bible Hill-Millbrook-Salmon River on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, this is my final supplementary. Thank you for that response, Mr. Speaker, through you to the member. In 2013, the Department of Agriculture announced that 220,000 would actually be available this fiscal year for provincial CSAs. And this money was going towards helping Nova Scotia's existing operations better market themselves, as well as undertaking new research into sustainable farming practices. So my final question, Mr. Speaker, through you is, can the minister please explain how and when this $220,000 will be distributed?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are presently working on all the programs we have in the province and towards sustainable agriculture and to ensure that the industry is profitable and grows.
The Honourable Member for Fairview Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, recently I had the opportunity to speak to a young man who approached me on behalf of himself and a few other students who are from Nova Scotia but are attending medical school outside of the country. Their intent is to practice family medicine, and they'd like to be back here in the province working, and want to know specifically what the province is doing to make that transition for residency easier for them to return back to us.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my colleague from Halifax Fairview. One of the most important questions that have been asked in the House this session, and I know it's one that the Premier and I and many others and former ministers of health have been very, very frustrated by, when we have so many very, very capable medical graduates who train outside of Nova Scotia and who can't get back here for residency and to practice. It is one of the areas that I have asked the committee dealing with the recruitment and retention of doctors to take a look at. It's one that I will join BC at the National Ministers Conference in the fall to change the way that the current practice operates.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my question through you is to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. First of all, I just want to say, you know, with the traffic that will be coming down the 103 and the 101 once the new ferry starts coming through, I want to underline there's a number of deficiencies along a couple of those highways that need to be addressed. The first one that I will underline is the completion of those two highways. Of course, the 103, there is some work going on through Port Mattoon, and of course, there's the issue of everything down the 103 or the 101 as you go down through Weymouth. So I'm just wondering where in the department's world are the completion of the 101 and the 103 on its radar?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. With the 103, well, first of all, with both projects, the reality is, and I know the member is very aware of this, and all members of the House are, these are massive investments on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia, and we truly do require the partnership with the federal government, which has been outstanding to this point, certainly in my tenure and long before me. You know, the Building Canada Fund is currently in negotiations, and we're working with our federal counterparts. There are components of those highway upgrades that are part of that. With the 103, obviously the Ingham-Port interchange is a key piece of infrastructure that we are currently proceeding with the intent that we would build the twinning from Metro and meet up with that interchange, and that is an important section of 103. The threshold for full twinning is about 10,000 vehicles per day, and that section of the 103 meets that criteria. So we are moving aggressively with that, building the Ingham-Port interchange with the hope that the feds will partner with us on that specific portion. With respect to the 101, there are a number of pieces along the entire 101 which we are engaging with our federal counterparts as well. There's some short-term measures that we can take to improve safety, and we're working with members from all sides of the House on some of those short-term measures. But with respect to the long-term measure, that again will be subject to the discussion with the federal members. And I'd like to acknowledge the MLA for Digby, who has been very, very strong in representing his community on those issues. So again, we're working on those as best we can. Thanks.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, I don't know what the member for Digby-Clare has been doing yet, but I know the previous member for Digby would have spoke really passionately about the 101 and completing, well, to complete the 101. He would have spoke about alders as well, but I'm sure this one is also important to him as well. So I hope the new member takes that up with you as well. The issue I do want to talk about specifically is the intersection to the Pubnicos. And I know the Minister of Natural Resources knows it well. As you come down that highway, there are a lot of level crossings, and probably the most fishing product, the highest value fishing product in all of Canada comes out of the port in Lower West Pubnico. And a lot of those trucks are turning off of the highway onto the 103 and causing a bit of a problem. So if you can imagine that kind of traffic hitting a flat intersection, it's very difficult. So I just wanted to maybe ask you the question that maybe in your discussions that there can be an ask of the federal government or of others that we look at an intersection for that specific intersection, a real intersection that with a bridge intersection and all, because it is getting quite dangerous, and I'm getting a lot of phone calls about it.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member. When we traveled down the southern shore and we went the 101 down and took the 103 back to the city, that was a particular area that was of a very significant interest to both the Deputy Minister Paul LaFleche and Chief Engineer Bruce Fitzner, and they pointed out the inherent dangers in that area, particularly when there's heavy volume using that corridor and certainly that intersection. So I think that is a conversation that we'll continue to have. Again, as the member understands, and as pointed out, that is certainly something that will take a significant investment. So for us, that could be on the table. You know, as the MLAs in the area offer their opinions on what should be the focus, we certainly take that seriously. And of course, the input from the members of Parliament from that way, the regional minister Peter MacKay, and the federal counterparts that would have some influence over that money. Certainly for us, again, I've said it many times, but I'll repeat it. This is all about road safety and the priorities that make sense and keep people safe, keep the economy going, and keep commuting happening in Nova Scotia. So for us, we'll take all the advice from the experts, and we'll invest those limited funds that we have to make sense and make sure people are as safe as possible when they use our highways.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
You know, and if I'm talking about that intersection, I should talk about the Argyle intersection as well, which is, I think, an engineering nightmare. How engineers can design something and forget about another road. And basically it's what happened in that area, and I know the minister knows it well, as they put a turning lane for one, they impeded themselves on access to another. So you have people turning one way to go to Nikhil Home for Special Care, and you have people turning the other way to go to the high school. It needs to be redesigned once again, be addressed, because there are far too many almost accidents. Thank goodness there's not accidents happening, but we've come close a whole bunch of times, and I hope the department does address that when they can.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions by members put to ministers has expired. Just before we move on to the next item of business, we're going to do a couple of introductions here. I'll start the show off. I'd like to draw your attention to the Speaker's Gallery, and we have with us today, that's unparliamentary, I must mention, though. It's
That's true. Just as we come to the closing days of this particular session, I know all members are aware that while we are in this House, we're not in our own homes, and there's great sacrifices made on behalf of all of our spouses, partners, and our families back home. So I do want to take a moment to introduce my beautiful wife, Stephanie, and my two lovely children, Jackson and Rachel. And